Late on a humid summer evening, a family of four packed themselves into a dark blue sedan and began the drive home. They had spent the day with relatives, sharing a meal and lingering longer than they intended. As night fell, they chose to take the familiar highway back toward their small town. The parents sat up front, their two children settled in the back, drowsy from the long day. It was the kind of routine trip countless families made every day, the sort no one thinks twice about. But somewhere along that stretch of road, in the quiet between mile markers, they disappeared. When relatives realized they hadn't arrived, worry set in quickly. Calls went unanswered. The family's driveway remained empty. By dawn, concern had turned into alarm. Police were notified, and the case began like any other. A standard welfare check, an assumption that perhaps the family had stopped overnight or taken a detour. But the hours passed, and no trace appeared. The first patrols drove the expected route, scanning shoulders, checking rest stops, even shining spotlights into ditches. The road was quiet, undisturbed. It was as though the sedan had never been there. Officers quickly established checkpoints along the highway, stopping passing drivers to ask if anyone had seen a car matching the description. Some recalled vague glimpses of headlights weaving in and out of traffic earlier in the night, but nothing concrete. Others were certain they'd seen the family at a gas station closer to town, though no receipts or surveillance tapes backed that up. Each account blurred into the next, and within hours, investigators were left with little more than conflicting fragments. The relatives clung to hope, giving officers every possible detail they could remember about the family's habits, the route they always drove, the time they usually left. Investigators marked each point on a map, tracing the possible paths. The distance was not long, less than an hour's drive, yet somewhere in that short stretch, the entire family vanished. By the second day, search efforts intensified. State police joined local units, helicopters swept above, and volunteers combed through wooded areas along the road. Every culvert, every ravine was searched. Officers walked shoulder to shoulder through fields and tree lines, calling out the family's names. The river was scanned from bridges, though nothing unusual was seen beneath the surface. Despite the massive effort, no tire tracks, no skid marks, no broken glass or car parts suggested a crash. It was as though the car had been lifted clean off the road and carried away. At press briefings, officials were careful with their words, describing the family as missing under uncertain circumstances. Reporters pushed for answers, but there were none. The absence of evidence created an unease that spread beyond the relatives. People in neighboring towns began locking doors earlier, hesitating to drive that particular highway. Stretch after dark. The first official theories focused on foul play. Could someone have intercepted them on the road? Was there a robbery or carjacking that left no witnesses? Detectives checked into known offenders in the area, questioning parolees and those with histories of highway crime. Nothing matched. Leads that initially seemed promising fizzled almost immediately. One truck driver claimed to have seen a sedan pulled over with its hazard lights on, but after hours of retracing, the location revealed no signs of a stop. For the relatives, the days blurred together in a haze of waiting. They sat through interviews, provided photographs, and answered the same questions over and over. Each time the phone rang, they braced themselves, hoping for good news, fearing the worst. Friends brought food that went untouched. Neighbors left flowers at the door. The family home felt frozen in time, its silence louder than words. By the end of the first week, detectives admitted privately that the trail had gone cold. There was no crime scene, no abandoned vehicle, no activity on the family's bank accounts or cell phones. For all intents and purposes, they had vanished without leaving a footprint. The uncertainty left investigators restless. Missing person cases usually began with something: a last phone call, a roadside sighting, a piece of debris. But here, there was nothing. The last verifiable point of contact was when the family waved goodbye to relatives hours earlier. Everything after that was speculation. As days stretched into weeks, the search perimeter expanded farther out, covering additional counties, other highways, and nearby towns. Still, there was nothing. Officials quietly scaled back manpower, though relatives refused to stop asking questions. Flyers went up on gas station doors, highway rest areas, even church bulletin boards. The faces of the missing family stared back at passers-by, reminding everyone of a mystery with no answers. The investigation that began as routine quickly hardened into something baffling. The open road, meant to carry travelers safely from one place to another, had instead swallowed a family whole. Their sedan was somewhere out there, hidden or buried beyond reach. Each night the highway looked the same as before, long stretches of asphalt cutting through farmland and woods, empty under the pale glow of headlights. Yet for those who knew the story, it had changed. That road now carried a shadow. And in the silence that followed, one haunting truth remained. A family of 4 had set out on a simple drive home, and in the span of less than an hour, they had vanished into nothingness. The question was no longer just where they had gone, but how something so ordinary could turn into one of the most unsettling mysteries the region had ever seen. Detectives began by returning to the most basic step, retracing the route the family should have taken. They drove the same stretch of highway mile by mile, stopping at every gas station and rest stop along the way. Clerks were interviewed, security tapes reviewed, receipts cross-checked. Yet not a single piece of evidence showed the family's car pulling in for fuel, snacks, or a bathroom break. It was as though the sedan had never left the relatives' driveway that night, even though everyone knew it had. Bridges became another focus. Officers walked along the railings with flashlights, peering down into dark water, searching for bent metal or signs of disturbance. Divers were briefly called to check under 2 major spans, but the currents were strong, and nothing unusual was discovered. A family car sinking in those waters should have left something behind. Oil slicks, floating debris, tire marks leading off the road. Instead, the surfaces lay smooth, hiding nothing. In the early days of the search, investigators clung to the possibility of a voluntary disappearance. Families had vanished before, sometimes to escape debt, sometimes to start over somewhere new. Detectives pulled bank records, credit card statements, and checked phone logs. But nothing supported the theory. The family's finances were stable, their accounts untouched. No calls had been made after the night they left the relative's house. No credit cards were used, no loans withdrawn, no cash pulled from ATMs. Their lives had been paused mid-motion, with no sign of intentional flight. Attention turned to robbery and abduction. Detectives examined known offenders who operated along highways. Truck stops, often magnets for transients and drifters, were quietly canvassed. Officers questioned long-haul drivers who might have shared the road that night. But there was no chatter, no unusual reports of conflict or violence. The highway patrol logged no incidents, no emergency calls from that area. Even the weather offered no clear explanation. The night had been warm, humid, but not stormy, not dangerous enough to push a car off the road unseen. Every avenue seemed to collapse as quickly as it appeared. Detectives mapped out the family's drive down to the exact minute it should have taken, noting the gas stations and intersections where they should have been visible. Cameras at toll booths and intersections captured dozens of vehicles that matched the time frame, but never their sedan. It was as though the family had traveled into a blind spot in reality where evidence refused to exist. As days stretched into weeks, the investigative notes grew more speculative. Some officers wondered about an ambush on a rural turnout, a vehicle forced off the road into the woods, hidden quickly in the dead of night. Others speculated about organized crime, cars being stolen and stripped, families eliminated to remove witnesses. But again, there was no evidence. No local gangs or crime groups were active in the area at that time. No reports of chop shops operating nearby. Each theory ended where it started, with nothing. The emptiness of the case unsettled even seasoned detectives. Missing persons usually left a trail, even faint. A piece of fabric snagged on brush, a broken fence post, a wallet tossed aside. But in this case, there was nothing at all. Patrol cars drove the stretch again and again, their headlights sweeping over the same empty fields, the same tree lines, as if searching harder might cause something to materialize. It never did. Family members were interviewed repeatedly. and each time their answers were the same. The family had been happy, grounded, rooted in their community. There were no debts, no disputes, no signs of wanting to vanish. Relatives described them as ordinary, careful, unlikely to take risks. For investigators, this only deepened the confusion. A family that stable should have left some trace behind. The longer the search went on, the more the case began to feel untouchable. Leads were followed into neighboring counties, then into other states. Similar vehicles spotted by witnesses turned out to belong to other families, other drivers. Dead ends piled one atop the next, until the investigation resembled a web of crossed-out notes and empty boxes. Theories about abduction or robbery were never ruled out, but they remained unsupported, drifting like smoke without fire. The media began to lose interest, their attention shifting toward newer stories. For those left behind, however, time seemed to stop entirely. The case, once filled with urgent motion, began to freeze. Detectives admitted in hushed tones that they had no explanation. Between 1 mile marker and the next, a family of 4 had simply ceased to exist. It left behind a silence heavier than any answer. And as the months closed in around that silence, one truth became clear. The mystery was no longer just about where the family had gone. It was about how a modern investigation, with maps, checkpoints, and technology, could find absolutely nothing. The case was not merely unsolved, it was suspended, frozen in place, waiting for something that might never come. In the months that followed, the investigation shifted from methodical searches to darker theories. Detectives, unable to locate a car or a single trace of the family, began considering possibilities they had resisted at first. One idea was an ambush. The stretch of highway where the family vanished was rural, poorly lit, and lined with hidden turnouts where a predator could wait unseen. Could someone have forced them off the road, carried out an attack, and concealed both the family and the car? Officers studied known offenders, combed through criminal records, and even looked into cold cases of roadside robberies. The pattern, however, refused to fit neatly. No one active in the area matched the profile of someone capable of erasing an entire family in one night. Another possibility pointed toward long-haul truckers. Rumors spread of a highway predator, a driver who picked victims at random, targeting vehicles isolated on dark stretches of road. Families whispered about it, online forums dissected the theory, and some investigators considered it quietly. A handful of witnesses claimed they had seen a large van or truck with one broken headlight traveling near the family's route that night. Some insisted the vehicle was following too closely, almost shadowing the sedan. Yet when officers tracked down vehicles with matching descriptions, none could be tied to the disappearance. The lead lingered like smoke, suggestive but impossible to grasp. The lack of evidence pushed investigators to widen their scope. They reached into neighboring states, asking police departments to share reports of accidents, abandoned vehicles, or unidentified remains. Bulletins were distributed to scrapyards, hoping someone might have seen the car dismantled or crushed. Nothing came back. Highway cameras in adjacent regions failed to show the vehicle crossing over. It was as if the sedan had entered a sealed corridor where surveillance simply didn't exist. Speculation only grew as the case dragged on. Some detectives began whispering about the possibility of a staged disappearance. Could the family themselves have orchestrated their vanishing? It was an uncomfortable suggestion, one that relatives strongly rejected. But investigators felt obligated to consider every angle. The theory quickly fell apart under scrutiny. The family had no debts, no legal troubles, no history of running away. Their lives had been steady, their community ties strong. If they had chosen to disappear, they would have needed extensive planning, yet there was no evidence of preparation. The idea felt forced, born more from desperation than logic. Witness interviews produced more contradictions than clarity. A motorist swore they saw a car pulled onto the shoulder, a man standing beside it, but the description of the car's color shifted with each retelling. Another driver claimed they passed a sedan with children visible in the back seat, but they couldn't confirm it was the missing family. Stories about the van with the broken headlight became tangled, with some witnesses saying they saw it tailing the family and others insisting it was parked miles away. Each detail raised hope, then unraveled under closer examination. As weeks turned into months, detectives began to feel the weight of futility. Each fractured lead seemed to lead them further away from the truth, scattering the investigation in multiple directions. They were dealing with shadows, rumors, and half-seen memories. Search teams swept through wooded areas again, even digging where tire ruts suggested vehicles had once driven off-road. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to the earth, but they found no trace of human scent connected to the family. Rivers were checked repeatedly, bridges surveyed again and again, yet the silence of the highway remained unbroken. Theories began to overlap with folklore. Some locals swore the highway itself was cursed, pointing to older cases of disappearances nearby. Others clung to the idea of an organized group, human traffickers, cult members, or criminals using remote stretches of road to carry out abductions. Detectives logged every tip, however unlikely, and chased them until the path inevitably ended. What remained was an investigation growing thinner by the day, spread wide across jurisdictions but anchored to no evidence. For the family's relatives, these fractured theories were almost worse than silence. Each time police shared a new possibility, hope briefly flared, only to collapse when the theory proved hollow. They attended every update, listened as detectives described vans, predators, and staged disappearances, and walked away with no clearer picture of what had happened. The absence of truth left space only for imagination, and imagination was merciless. By the end of the third month, the case carried the weight of something unreal. An entire family had been swallowed, and every explanation seemed flawed. Theories of ambush, highway predators, and vanishing acts had been stacked one atop the other, but none could be proven. The more time passed, the more it seemed that the truth was not just hidden, but actively resisting discovery. And that growing impossibility set the stage for something even more painful. If the traditional theories failed, then perhaps the answer lay not in suspects or sightings, but in the slow, quiet ache of those left behind. People who would spend years trying to fill the silence with meaning, and finding none. The first year after the disappearance was marked by relentless movement. Relatives organized search parties, followed up on rumors, and called the sheriff's office so often that dispatchers began to recognize their voices. Birthdays passed in silence, holidays sat half-empty around dinner tables. The family's house, once filled with noise, became a monument to absence. At night, the parents left the porch light on, convinced that if the missing family returned, they should see a glow guiding them home. But as months turned into years, the urgency began to clash with exhaustion. Friends drifted away, neighbors stopped asking questions, and the case slipped from newspapers. The family was not forgotten, but they were no longer part of daily conversation. Relatives, however, couldn't move forward. The mother of one of the parents kept a calendar marked with every new year, noting "still missing" on the top of each page. She refused to pack away photographs, lining them across the mantel where she whispered prayers each night. The father drove the highway often, pulling onto shoulders and scanning the tree lines, convinced that maybe a piece of metal, a scrap of fabric, or some small, overlooked clue might still be waiting. Siblings of the missing children carried a different kind of weight. They grew older, started families of their own, and yet found themselves haunted by the thought that their nieces and nephews were frozen at the age they disappeared. One described driving the same route once a month for years, eyes fixed on guardrails, rivers, and turnouts, desperate for something the police might have missed. Each drive ended in disappointment, but the habit never stopped. Psychologists who later studied the case described the grief as ambiguous loss. It is the particular torment of not knowing whether a loved one is alive or dead, safe or suffering. Without answers, the mind invents scenarios, replaying them endlessly. Families of the missing often swing between hope and despair, trapped in a cycle that prevents healing. In interviews, relatives said it was like waking up every day into the same nightmare. They could not mourn properly because no proof of death existed, and they could not live normally because the chance of return was always there. The toll showed in physical ways too. Some developed insomnia, others high blood pressure or stress-related illness. Counselors noted that unresolved disappearance cases often fracture family structures, creating arguments about how much to keep searching, how much money to spend on private investigators, whether to hold memorials. In this case, relatives clung together more than they broke apart, but beneath the unity was a quiet exhaustion. Over the years, there were brief surges of attention. A documentary crew once revisited the case, hoping to revive leads. For a short time, it seemed as though public interest returned. Old witnesses were re-interviewed, rumors resurfaced, and tips poured in. Each call felt like it could finally be the one to answer the mystery. Yet, as before, every tip collapsed. Vehicles thought to match the family's car were found intact, driven by other owners. Bones discovered in a rural area turned out to belong to animals. False hope became its own kind of cruelty, reopening wounds just as they began to scab. Through all this, the parents of the missing father never gave up. They left the porch light on for decades, even when the bulb burned out repeatedly. They bought replacements in bulk, each new light screwed in with the same trembling hands. To them, it was a beacon, a promise that the family was not forgotten. For neighbors driving by, it became a haunting sight, a house lit every night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, as if waiting for someone who would never arrive. The children's former school teachers remembered them too. Desks once filled by their presence stood empty, their names slowly erased from attendance rosters, but never from memory. A classmate, years later, recalled how the seats were left untouched for weeks after their disappearance, as if waiting for them to return. That small act mirrored the larger grief, a waiting without end. By the 15th year, most official search efforts had gone dormant. Detectives who once carried the case file retired, new. Officers inherited it reluctantly, and the evidence box gathered dust in storage. To law enforcement, it became a cold case, but for the families, it remained as raw as day one. They continued to call occasionally, asking if there was anything new, their voices breaking when the answer was always no. The cruelest part was the silence of the road itself. Relatives often drove the highway where the disappearance occurred. It looked unchanged, the same bends, the same stretches of farmland and woods. Cars sped past, unaware of the shadow hanging over that asphalt. For those who remembered, every mile marker carried a ghost. And so, time moved forward for the world, but not for them. 20 years passed with no resolution, leaving relatives aged, some dying without ever knowing what happened. Yet the mystery still held its grip, refusing to loosen. They never stopped asking, never stopped hoping that one day something would surface. And as the silence deepened, so did the need for closure. It was this silence, stretching endlessly, that set the stage for the one thing no one expected. Nature itself would shift, and the river near that highway would one day reveal what decades of searching never could. Years after the family vanished, investigators quietly reopened the files, driven less by new evidence and more by a disturbing pattern that had begun to emerge. Reports of disappearances along the same stretch of highway were accumulating, each strange in its own way, each resisting explanation. A young man driving home from work never arrived. His car was found abandoned several exits away, keys still in the ignition. A couple traveling through the area on vacation left a motel late at night and were never seen again. In another case, a truck driver reported seeing a vehicle swerve violently near the river bend, but by the time he doubled back, there was nothing. None of these cases mirrored the vanished family perfectly, but together they painted a troubling picture. Detectives began to wonder if the stretch of road itself played a role. They mapped out the locations of each unexplained event, and many clustered near the same few miles where the family had disappeared. There were no sharp cliffs, no notoriously dangerous intersections, no reason why so many vehicles and people should vanish without trace. Yet the pattern was undeniable. For some officers, it suggested the presence of a hidden danger, a predator who knew the road intimately, or an organized group using its isolation to their advantage. For locals, the highway's reputation grew darker with each passing year. Truckers whispered about a black zone, a part of the road where cell signals weakened, headlights seemed swallowed by the darkness, and travelers went missing without explanation. Rumors spread about hitchhikers who vanished after being picked up, about families who drove through late at night and reported seeing strange vehicles tailing them for miles before, suddenly vanishing from sight. Though none of these stories could be verified, they fed into the highway's grim mythology. Theories circulated widely, some grounded in crime, others drifting toward the supernatural. Organized crime was a common suggestion. Perhaps stolen cars were being dumped or stripped in remote areas, with victims eliminated to ensure silence. Others believed human trafficking rings might have operated along the corridor, exploiting its remoteness to abduct people unseen. Yet, investigators who pressed into those theories found little evidence. There were no networks uncovered, no arrests made, no concrete proof tying the highway to organized criminal activity. As more time passed without answers, the theories grew stranger. Residents spoke of the land itself as cursed, pointing to old accidents and unexplained deaths in the same vicinity. Some claimed the river near the bend had taken countless lives, swallowing vehicles in silence. Stories of headlights trailing behind drivers only to vanish into thin air became part of the local folklore. For grieving relatives, these tales were both infuriating and heartbreaking. They wanted truth, not superstition, but in the absence of evidence, myths filled the void. Law enforcement found itself caught between rational investigation and public perception. Detectives knew the power of patterns, but they also knew the danger of reading too much into coincidences. Still, the similarities between the vanished family and other disappearances gnawed at them. The highway was not especially long, yet within its span lay more mysteries than seemed reasonable. Officers debated whether to assign new task forces, but budgets were thin and priorities shifted elsewhere. The file on the missing family thickened with notes and clippings, but no breakthroughs came. Meanwhile, the community carried the weight of unease. Parents warned their children not to drive the highway after dark. Truckers avoided stopping along its shoulders. Some residents swore they felt watched when they drove its length alone. The missing family became a cautionary tale told to newcomers, a reminder that ordinary roads could hide extraordinary dangers. Their photographs appeared in books and television specials, their faces frozen in time as examples of lives stolen by a highway that gave no explanation. Private investigators occasionally revisited the area, hired by desperate relatives or curious journalists. They set up cameras, interviewed old witnesses, even sent divers back into the river. Each effort ended the same way, with no car, no bodies, no answers. The mystery remained intact, and with each failed attempt, the legend only deepened. What unsettled many was how easily the story slipped from crime into folklore. The family's disappearance no longer felt like a solvable case. It had become part of the region's identity, the kind of story passed down through generations. It was a shadow that stretched across decades, a reminder that sometimes the most familiar places could become the most unknowable. But beneath the whispers and theories, one fact remained constant. The family had vanished somewhere along that road, and their car had never been found. That reality could not be explained away by superstition. The mystery was still waiting, silent beneath the surface, and in time, nature itself would intervene, forcing the truth back into the open in a way no one could have predicted. In the years that followed, the case shifted from official investigation into the hands of those who refused to let it go. Documentarians discovered the story, building episodes around the disappearance of the family. Old news footage was replayed, interviews with surviving relatives were recorded, and maps were redrawn on screen to highlight where they might have gone missing. These productions sparked new waves of public interest, each time giving hope that fresh attention might shake something loose. But with every broadcast came the same reality. No matter how often the story was retold, no new evidence surfaced. The internet became the new meeting ground for speculation. forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries filled with posts dissecting every detail. Some members claimed a serial killer trucker had stalked the highway for decades, using rest stops to hunt victims. They tied the family's disappearance to other unsolved cases, drawing red strings between names and dates as though connecting them might finally reveal the truth. Others leaned toward darker, more sensational theories, a cult operating in the nearby woods, abducting families for rituals that left no trace. A few even argued that authorities knew more than they admitted, suggesting a cover-up by witnesses who stayed silent out of fear. Each theory gained traction for a time, especially when tied to half-remembered rumors or unexplained police reports. Amateur sleuths scoured old newspapers, convinced that buried somewhere in small-town columns was the missing puzzle piece. They pored over property maps, looking for abandoned quarries or disused barns where a car could be hidden forever. Yet, no amount of digging brought the family back into focus. Every online thread ended the same way, with speculation piled on speculation and nothing solid to ground it. Some groups raised funds to bring divers back to the rivers and reservoirs near the highway. They carried advanced sonar equipment, scanning the water's depths in hopes of detecting a shape buried in the mud. Viewers watched live streams of divers surfacing, pulling up branches, rusted debris, or animal bones. But not a single object connected to the missing family was recovered. Waterways that seemed the most logical explanation proved empty, frustrating those who believed the answer had to lie beneath the surface. For relatives, these renewed efforts were difficult to watch. On one hand, they were grateful that strangers cared enough to keep searching, even decades later. On the other, every fruitless dive reopened the wound of uncertainty. They found themselves pulled back into cycles of hope and despair, watching as strangers online debated their family's fate like it was an unsolved riddle rather than the deepest pain of their lives. Investigators who had once worked the case kept their distance. Many had retired, and those still in service admitted quietly that they no longer expected answers. The file remained in storage, its papers yellowing, its photographs fading. Some officers even resented the online speculation, feeling it turned a serious investigation into a carnival of rumor. But they, too, had no explanation. They could not provide closure, and so the vacuum of silence continued to fill with noise. Over time, the family's disappearance became something larger than a case file. It became a cautionary legend told to children and newcomers. Locals said, "Don't drive that highway at night," or "That's where people disappear." The specifics of the family, their names, their faces, the reality of who they were, faded behind the outline of a story repeated too often. The tragedy became detached from its human core, shifting into folklore that carried more mystery than memory. This detachment was its own cruelty. The real people who had vanished, the lives that had been lost, were overshadowed by theories of truckers, cults, or conspiracies. What remained in the public's mind was not the truth, but the haunting absence of it. And as each new theory collapsed, each new dive ended in silence. The legend only deepened. Yet silence, no matter how long it lasts, can shift. The land itself has ways of keeping secrets until the moment it no longer can. And in this case, the answers that had eluded families, investigators, and strangers alike were not buried in myths, but hidden beneath water and time, waiting for a storm strong enough to bring them back into the light. It was more than 2 decades after the family vanished when nature did what investigators never could. A violent storm swept through the county, bringing heavy rains that lasted for days. The river near the old bridge rose higher than anyone could remember, spilling over its banks and carving into the land around it. When the floodwaters finally receded, they left behind a changed landscape. Trees had been uprooted, banks collapsed, and the riverbed itself looked torn open, reshaped by the force of water. Locals who walked the banks in the aftermath noticed strange shapes beneath the lowered waterline, half buried in silt and tangled in debris. At first, people assumed it was just storm wreckage, branches, rusted barrels, the usual remains dragged downstream. but whispers began to spread that this looked different. One fisherman claimed he saw the edge of a metal frame glinting in the sun. Another swore he spotted the outline of tires lodged deep in the mud. Soon, speculation ignited in town. Some said it was the wreck of a truck that had gone missing years earlier. Others, with hushed voices, wondered if it could be the long-lost car that had haunted the community since the family's disappearance. After so many false starts and fruitless searches, the possibility alone was enough to stir long-buried hope and dread. Authorities were alerted quickly. A recovery team was dispatched to the site, though skepticism lingered. They had been called to rivers before, had pulled up hunks of scrap metal and old farm equipment mistaken for vehicles. But when divers entered the murky current this time, they confirmed that something large, something shaped like a car, was wedged deep into the riverbed. Word spread instantly, and by the next morning, onlookers lined the banks. Some came out of curiosity, others because they had lived with this mystery for decades and needed to see whether the silence was finally breaking. The divers worked carefully, their movements slow in the silt-heavy water. The currents tugged at them, the visibility almost non-existent. They traced their hands along the buried object until they were certain this was a vehicle. Rust had eaten away much of its surface, but its form was unmistakable. The recovery team surfaced with the news, and a murmur rippled through the crowd on the banks. For many, it felt like the first real step toward an answer in 26 years. Rumors flew faster than facts could confirm them. Some insisted the license plate would prove it was the family's car. Others doubted, suggesting the storm had merely uncovered another accident unrelated to the case. But in the faces of the relatives who still lived in town, the possibility alone was overwhelming. They had lived with a void for so long that even the hint of discovery brought tears, anxiety, and fear of disappointment. Specialized equipment was brought in to stabilize the area. Heavy cables were anchored to the riverbank, ready to drag the object from the mud. Crews debated how best to lift it without breaking apart what might be fragile evidence. Every step was cautious. Decades underwater had weakened the frame, and any rush could destroy vital clues. Days stretched into a tense wait as preparations were made, each hour drawing more spectators and more speculation. The storm had exposed something undeniable, and the timing itself felt almost unreal. After countless failed searches, after divers had scanned this river before with no results, it was only the violent reshaping of the land that revealed what had been hidden all along. For law enforcement, it was humbling, proof that even the most thorough investigations could miss what nature alone could uncover. As the vehicle was slowly cleared of silt, more details emerged. The roofline became visible beneath the water. A wheel, still clinging to its rusted rim, broke the surface briefly before sinking back down. It was enough to silence doubts. This was not debris. This was not a false lead. Something, some truth long buried, had finally been unearthed by the storm. For the relatives who had waited decades, the moment was unbearable. They stood at the riverbank watching crews prepare, their faces carrying the strain of years lived in limbo. They wanted answers, but they feared them just as much. If this was the car, it meant the truth of what happened to their loved ones would finally be known. It also meant facing the reality of loss after years of clinging to hope. The river that had swallowed its secret for over 2 decades was at last giving it back. The storm had shifted everything, exposing the first real lead since the night the family disappeared. The recovery crews knew what came next would not just be about pulling a car from the water. It would be about pulling the truth into daylight and bracing for what that truth might reveal. When divers returned to the river after the storm, they worked with a precision born of both urgency and caution. The vehicle buried deep in the mud was fragile after decades underwater. Its frame was fused with silt, its roof collapsed in places, and rust had eaten away at its edges. Every tug of the cables risked tearing it apart, but leaving it submerged any longer meant risking the evidence washing downstream forever. Slowly, piece by piece, the river began to give up its hold. The first glimpse came when a wheel broke free, spinning uselessly as it rose above the surface before sinking back. Crews cheered quietly, not with triumph, but with relief. It was confirmation. This was no rumor, no piece of scrap. This was a car. From the outline alone, investigators could already see it match the make and model tied to the missing family. A collective unease rippled through the onlookers on the bank. For years, hope had coexisted with doubt. Now, both were collapsing into a single devastating possibility. The lift itself took hours. Heavy machinery strained against the weight of the river's resistance. Divers guided cables beneath the frame, careful not to crush fragile sections. At last, with a surge of effort, the vehicle shifted, broke loose from its muddy grave, and rose into daylight. Water poured from its open windows, silt streaming out in heavy clouds. The body of the car was bent, twisted, nearly unrecognizable, but it was whole enough to confirm what many feared. This was the missing sedan. As crews worked, silence spread across the riverbank. Relatives who had waited nearly 3 decades stood together, some clutching photographs, others gripping each other's hands so tightly their knuckles whitened. For them, this moment was not about the car itself, but about what it contained. When investigators peered inside, they found what the river had preserved in silence. Skeletal remains sat slumped within the wreck, tangled among the broken seats. Fragments of clothing clung to bone, their colors long since faded by water and time. A child's shoe lay pressed into a corner, its laces twisted, its shape eerily intact. A rusted thermos was wedged beneath a seat, its paint chipped but still visible, a quiet reminder of the normal life that had filled the car before that night. Each item pulled from the vehicle was catalogued with care. Forensic specialists handled everything gently, aware of the weight these objects carried. Waterlogged belongings were laid out to dry, from scraps of fabric to half-destroyed wallets. The smallest details, a set of keys, a watch, a crushed toy, felt monumental after years of emptiness. They were proof, not of speculation or rumor, but of existence. For the first time in 26 years, the family was no longer missing. They had been found. The recovery, though, was devastating. The skeletal remains told the story no one wanted confirmed. 4 sets, aligned with the seats they once occupied, left no doubt. This had been a family's final resting place. Investigators noted the positioning, the absence of signs of struggle, the way the bodies remained together. To trained eyes, it spoke of tragedy, not foul play. The car had gone into the water intact, its passengers still inside, and the river had swallowed them whole. For relatives, the sight was unbearable, yet strangely relieving. For decades, they had lived in limbo, imagining scenarios that ranged from abduction to murder to secret escape. Now the truth, however brutal, lay in front of them. Closure did not erase grief, but it replaced the endless torment of not knowing. Tears came freely on the banks of the river, not just from family members, but from strangers who had followed the case for years. News spread quickly. Local stations broke the story first, then national outlets picked it up. "Family missing for 26 years, found in river," headlines read. The discovery reignited attention on the case, sparking interviews, retrospectives, and a flood of condolences. For many in the community, it was surreal to see the story they had lived with for decades finally arrive at a conclusion. Yet even with the car recovered, questions remained. How had the vehicle left the road? Why had searches of this river decades earlier failed to uncover it? And most painfully, what final moments had unfolded inside before the water took them? Investigators prepared to send the remains to labs where forensic experts would attempt to reconstruct the night of the disappearance. Answers, at last, seemed within reach. The river had concealed the truth for over 2 decades, guarding it against every search, every diver, every desperate theory. But now, forced open by storm and time, it had given it back. The car was no longer a myth, no longer the subject of whispers. It was real, and it carried with it the story of what happened that night. The next step was to piece together those final moments, and to learn whether this was truly an accident or if something darker still lingered behind the wheel. When the vehicle was finally pulled from the riverbank, investigators wasted no time reopening the case. Forensic teams moved in, determined to study every inch of what remained. The first step was confirmation. DNA samples were taken from the skeletal remains, cross-checked against surviving relatives. Within days, the results returned. There was no doubt the bodies belonged to the family that had vanished 26 years earlier. The mystery of their whereabouts was resolved, but the question of how they ended up in the river remained. The car itself was treated like a crime scene. Technicians in protective gear combed through the wreck, photographing the interior and bagging evidence. Though decades underwater had erased much, key details survived. The vehicle's structure showed clear signs of impact. The front end was crumpled inward, the bumper sheared and bent in ways consistent with striking a guardrail before plunging downward. Windows had shattered inward rather than outward, consistent with the force of water filling the cabin at high speed. For specialists, the wreckage told a story of sudden violence, not a prolonged struggle. Attention soon turned back to the highway. Investigators studied the section near the bridge once more, comparing it with the data from the recovered car. Tire marks, faint but still visible even after years of weathering, were found leading away from the lane and toward the guardrail. To the untrained eye, they looked like nothing more than old scars on the pavement, but forensic analysts confirmed they aligned with the make and model of the family's vehicle. At the bend in the road, the steel barrier itself bore evidence of an old collision. A section, long thought to be wear and tear, had markings consistent with the crumpled front end of the car now pulled from the river. The reconstruction began to form. Late at night, under poor visibility, the family's sedan appeared to have lost control on the slick pavement. Investigators considered weather records from that evening. Reports confirmed humidity was high and fog pockets had been noted along the river valley. It may have been enough to obscure the curve ahead. Combined with fatigue from a long day, it painted a grimly plausible picture. The driver may have misjudged the bend, the tires slipped, and the car struck the guardrail. The barrier bent under the impact, failing to stop the vehicle from plunging into the river below. Forensic divers returned to the site, this time searching for additional debris. They found fragments of glass scattered downstream, along with rusted pieces of trim consistent with the missing car. These pieces further supported the scenario of an impact and plunge rather than an orchestrated disappearance. There was no sign of another vehicle forcing them off the road, no evidence of sabotage to the car's mechanics. The conclusion, though painful, was clear. This was an accident. Medical examiners studied the remains for trauma. The injuries, though difficult to interpret after decades underwater, were consistent with blunt force impact followed by drowning. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of binding, nothing to suggest foul play. Every scientific detail reinforced what the wreck had already implied. For years, rumors of abduction, serial killers, and conspiracies had overshadowed the case. But the truth was simpler, quieter, and no less tragic. For relatives, the findings brought a heavy silence. Closure had come not through dramatic revelation, but through the cold certainty of forensic analysis. The decades of fear and speculation, the endless late-night drives searching for clues, were replaced by a single devastating truth. Their loved ones had been lost to the river on the very night they disappeared. The accident had been sudden, the end unavoidable, and the water, shifting and silting over time, had hidden them from view for a generation. In public statements, investigators were careful to honor both the science and the grief. They explained how the evidence aligned: the bent guardrail, the tire marks, the front-end damage, the positioning of the remains. They confirmed there was no foul play, no killer at large, no conspiracy to uncover. The mystery had not been solved by uncovering some human monster, but by revealing the simple cruelty of chance and circumstance. Still, the findings raised difficult questions. Why had the car not been found earlier, when the river had been searched multiple times in the first years of the investigation? Some divers admitted the water levels and heavy silt made detection nearly impossible. The river's current had shifted over time, burying the car deeper, making it invisible to sonar. It was only the storm, tearing away the bank and reshaping the flow, that had exposed what had been hidden all along. The conclusion was final, yet bittersweet. The family's fate was no longer a mystery, but the decades lost to speculation could never be reclaimed. For those left behind, knowing the truth meant living with a different kind of burden, the acceptance that their loved ones had been gone all along, just beyond reach. And as the investigators closed their report with the word accident, the case that had haunted a community for 26 years was at last prepared to meet its end. But one final step remained, to lay bare not only the facts of the accident, but the meaning of it, the cruel paradox of closure found too late, and the silence that only a river could hold for so long. On the night they vanished, investigators now believe the family's final journey ended in a matter of seconds. Driving home after a long day, the road ahead had been slick with mist and patches of fog clinging low near the river bend. The section of highway where their car was later found had long been known for poor visibility and its shallow guardrail. Tire impressions on the pavement, faint even after all these years, told the story. The vehicle drifted slightly, then swerved hard, striking the barrier. The impact bent steel, but the guardrail gave way, and in an instant, the sedan plunged off the road. The river was high that night, the current fast. When the car hit the water, it would have filled quickly, pulling its passengers down before any had a chance to escape. In darkness, silence, and rushing water, the entire family was gone within moments. The river then became their grave, swallowing the wreck and burying it deeper with each season's shifting currents. What searchers had scoured from the surface never revealed what lay hidden beneath the mud. For decades, the truth remained just out of reach. Divers in the early years had searched this very stretch, yet the river gave them nothing. Silt shifted constantly, covering evidence as quickly as it could be uncovered. The car became part of the riverbed itself, preserved in silence. Families searching the shoreline never saw it. Officers running sonar scans passed over it, their readings distorted by debris and current. Year after year, the secret remained undisturbed. What haunted relatives most was not knowing. Without answers, their minds created endless scenarios: abduction, foul play, conspiracies. They imagined the family alive somewhere or suffering at the hands of strangers. They lived in a limbo where every day carried the weight of unanswered questions. Now, forensic evidence brought an end to speculation. There had been no predators on the road, no shadowy figures waiting in the dark. The tragedy was quieter, but no less brutal. It was a simple loss of control on a dangerous bend, magnified by nature's indifference. Closure came heavy. For parents and siblings who had waited, the relief of answers collided with the grief of finality. The porch light left burning for decades no longer needed to glow. The drives along the highway in search of clues no longer held purpose. The vigil of waiting was over, but it left behind the sorrow of knowing their loved ones had been gone all along, only yards from the road, unseen. The discovery forced the community to reckon with how easily mystery had grown from silence. For 26 years, stories had filled the void, tales of killers, cults, and conspiracies. Yet the truth was simpler and harsher. The land itself had hidden them. Human imagination had tried to make sense of an absence, while the real answer rested quietly beneath the water. Officials closed the case with final reports, noting the accident's cause as driver error compounded by road conditions. The family's remains were returned to relatives for burial. Their decades-long limbo finally ended. For investigators, there was relief that the mystery had an explanation, but also a recognition that the truth had been there from the beginning, overlooked by circumstance and concealed by the environment itself. In the end, the story was not about foul play or conspiracy, but about the silence of nature, the way a river can take and hold without giving back. The truth beneath the current was a tragedy written in water and time, a family lost not to violence, but to a bend in the road and the pull of a river that buried them for a generation. And though answers had finally been found, The weight of those years could never be erased. Closure does not undo grief. It only gives it shape. For the loved ones who had waited 26 years, the mystery was no longer unsolved, but the sorrow of what had been hidden beneath the current would remain forever.